the year in Nepal or India, but now for 18 months, but who's counting? I've been just here at Chenrezig Institute. So I became a nun 34 years ago in 1987. And I first met the Buddha Dharma in India at our center there called Tushita Retreat Center in 1983. And I think in that course, I was voted the person least likely to take refuge and become Buddhist because I came from a scientific background. I was a doctor, very brief medical career. So I questioned everything that I was being told. And of course, actually in Buddhism, you're encouraged to do that, to question and be skeptical about everything you hear and check out from your own experience. But I had quite profound experiences during the course, and my overwhelming feeling was like I'd come home, that things I'd been thinking or investigating for many years, I found many answers to questions, and more questions arose, and I felt confident that Buddhism and the Lamas had the answers that I needed. And so far, so good. I haven't had any doubts about that. So in terms of what I do as a nun, I quickly became involved in transcribing. It was quite funny in the beginning because I didn't understand our teacher, Lama Zopa Rinpoche. He teaches in English, but it's very idiosyncratic English. So my very first teaching, I basically didn't understand a word he said. And I came out of the teaching and all these older students were there saying, oh, wasn't that fantastic? Wasn't that an amazing teaching? And I thought, these people are mad, you know, because Rinpoche had, still has to some degree, this teaching habit of constant repetition. He repeats things over and over. At that stage, he did a lot of coughing and interruptions of the teaching. And plus, I wasn't attuned to his voice, so I didn't really know what he was teaching. But despite that, and the fact that I at that stage couldn't type and didn't know any Dharma, I started transcribing his teachings. So that's the way I learned or studied Dharma. And so from the transcribing, I moved into editing. So my main occupation now, although it hasn't been for the last year or so, is editing Lama Zopa Rinpoche's teachings. And so I do that, have laptop will travel, so I do that here, and I do it also in India and Nepal when I'm based there. So first thing I'd like to know is if there's anyone here who's totally new to Buddhism. Yeah, okay, just, you know, a little, and in terms of other people's experience? A little, okay, so it kind of influences how I pitch the course and how much I explain about certain things, because the text that we'll be going through was taught by a Tibetan Lama to Tibetans who already have not only they have the culture of Buddhism. So a lot of things that we question, they have complete faith in without questioning. Not that the questioning is wrong, but they make many assumptions in the things they say that might not be suitable for the Western mind. So the text, you all should all have received a copy of it. And so it belongs to a class of teaching called in Tibetan Lojong. So Lo means mind and Jong means training. So mind training is a simple way to understand this. And it's sometimes translated as thought transformation, similar meaning. So it's important in Buddhism to trace the lineage of the teachings that you're hearing. So the lineage of this, of course, comes, as all our teachers do originally, from Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, depicted in this statue here. But in terms of how they came to Tibet, they were brought to Tibet in the 10th, 11th century by a famous Indian teacher called Lama Atisha, who you may have heard of. So Lama Atisha is very important in Tibetan Buddhism, especially in our tradition, as he's the master who introduced the concept of Lam Rim, which is a Tibetan term that means the graduated path to enlightenment. So in a quite brief text or poem, he set out the graduated path for one person to achieve enlightenment. And I forget how many verses, there's not all that many verses in his text. But then when he came to Tibet and he actually composed, the text is called The Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment. He actually composed it in Tibet, specifically with Tibetans in mind. And later, over the centuries, many Tibetan lamas elaborated on that short text to multiple volumes, hundreds of pages. And it's the basic teachings that we are introduced to when we meet Buddhism as Westerners. So Lama Atisha was originally a prince in India. So I like history, so you'll have to bear with me. You're going to get a bit of history of how these things came about. So Lama Atisha was originally a prince in India, and his family very much wanted him to be the king who ran the kingdom, but he was more interested in a spiritual life. So quite young, he went in search of teachers, of gurus, and found various teachers, including tantric teachers. And at one stage got quite proud of his spiritual knowledge until one of his gurus pointed out that he was becoming arrogant and suggested that he become a monk. So he became a monk, I think in his late 20s or early 30s. And his main practices, or the reason that his main practice became this precious mind of bodhicitta. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this term, you'll have maybe seen all the signs on the paths coming up, which were put there at the instruction of our guru, Lama Zopa Rinpoche. So bodhicitta is, if you like, the ultimate development of loving kindness and compassion. So if you have this mind of bodhicitta, then your wish is to become enlightened, not for your own happiness and to solve your own problems, but to be able to relieve the suffering of all other living beings and bring them to that ultimate happiness of enlightenment. So it's a very precious realization. So Lama Atisha was introduced to the concept of this as being the most important thing he should develop when he was in Bodh Gaya, the place in India where Shakyamuni Buddha became enlightened. And so this is, again, the stories that come in this lineage, Tibetan Buddhism generally, is that statues there spoke to him. And what they told him basically was that the most important thing in life to develop is this precious thought of bodhicitta. And so he investigated and he found out that the holder of most of the lineages of how to develop bodhicitta actually lived in Indonesia, in Sumatra. So what he had to do then, along with a large group of disciples, is make a sea voyage from India to Sumatra. So here we're talking about this stage, I think we're talking the 10th century. I can't remember the dates now, late 10th century. So it's said that it took him more than a year to make that voyage. And of course, met many adventures along the way, including typhoons, whatever. So then he met this, his main guru, the guru that he regarded as his heart guru, who in Tibetan, his name is Tsulingpa, which means the person from the Golden Isle, which is what Sumatra was called. So then, having checked out the qualities of Tsulingpa, because you're never supposed to take on a guru or a teacher without checking out their qualities. So carefully, he checked those out. And when he was convinced that Tsulingpa was a genuine guru, then he spent 12 years studying the teachings on bodhicitta and other teachings with Tsulingpa. So for us from the West, this kind of seems extraordinary, right? You know, to follow a spiritual path, you travel over dangerous seas for a year and then you slowly check out this person and then you spend 12 years studying with them. But yeah, that's sometimes what it takes to follow a spiritual path, and especially in those days. So then Lama Atisha returned to India, became the abbot of one of the 3 large monasteries there called Vikramashila. So then at this time in Tibet, Buddhism had been introduced into Tibet centuries beforehand. But there was seen to have been degeneration of Buddhism, and there was a lot of confusion about how you practice it. And there were some people, because there are two big divisions you could see as Sutra and Tantra teachings within Buddhism. So Sutra are the open general teachings, and Tantra are the more esoteric, more secret teachings. And there was a thought that one person couldn't practice both, that you either concentrated on one or not on the other, and there was confusion about lineage of vows and different things. And so there was a religious king, a king with spiritual ideals at that time, who wanted to invite Lama Rinpoche from India, because he had the reputation as being knowledgeable, a pundit they called, knowledgeable in not only practice but in realizations. And so again, this is the kind of extraordinary lengths and the importance of spiritual practice in these times. So then a deputation of Tibetans was sent from Tibet to India. Now, in the 20th century, I traveled from Nepal to Tibet and back again, and found that kind of arduous. So I can't even imagine what they went through at these times. And of course, because Tibet was a high altitude plateau with very few diseases that were in India, almost all of them died. And they ended up having to send 2 deputations. And of course, the Indians didn't want to let Lama Rinpoche go, because he was an abbot of a major monastery and a renowned pundit. And when Lama Rinpoche checked, he had a special connection with Tara, this female Buddha here. And so he made prayers to Tara, and Tara answered in person and said that if he went to Tibet, his life would be shortened, but that he would bring great benefit to the people in Tibet. So because his motivation was bodhicitta, the benefit of the most people possible, then he undertook to go to Nepal. And they had to kind of fool the people in the monasteries who didn't want to let him go. And so initially, I think they said he was going on pilgrimage to Nepal, which he did on the way to Tibet. So he came to Tibet. And so there's one funny story. There's a famous story about Lama Rinpoche's cook. So when he went to Tibet, he took with him this Bengali cook who was really short-tempered, really bad-tempered, like notoriously angry person. And when some people asked Lama Rinpoche why he'd brought this really difficult person with him, and this is the way, an introduction to the way you think when you're trying to practice mind training or thought transformation, he said that it was excellent to have this cook around him because it gave him the opportunity to practice patience, because to practice patience, you have to have an angry person around you. So he deliberately kept near him an unpleasant, difficult person because it gave him an opportunity to train his own mind. So just think how radically opposite that is to the way we usually are with angry, difficult people. We just want to be separate from them. We don't want anything to do with them as far away as possible. But then I read this story recently this week. I found it quite amusing. At some point, he sent his Bengali cook home. And when they asked him why he'd done that, he said, well, he'd brought, he'd heard that Tibetans were these really easygoing people. And he'd brought the cook along with that opportunity to practice patience. But once he got to know the Tibetans better, he realized the Tibetans were difficult enough. He didn't need to have the Bengali cook with him. So he sent the cook home. So Lama Rinpoche, I think it was 17 years teaching in Tibet. And he was known as the refuge Lama because even though some of the Tibetans wanted these esoteric tantric teachings, he saw the most benefit for them were the basic teachings on things like karma and refuge. It's actually known as the refuge Lama. And of course, on loving kindness and compassion. And one sweet story I read this week was that when Lama Rinpoche met someone, he didn't say, how are you? He said something like, have you been kind today? Which is, yeah. So that was his interest. So Lama Rinpoche brought with him these teachings on Lojong, on mind training, but they were kept as secret teachings initially because it was thought that there was such a radical change from our ordinary way of thinking that most people wouldn't be able to grasp it or practice it. So they were just taught what's called from ear to ear, from a guru to a disciple or a small group of disciples. They weren't publicly taught at all. So this changed a few centuries later. And again, I haven't memorized the dates here. So what happened was there was this famous Nyung Lama. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the different traditions within Buddhism, there are 4 major traditions. So the first one that was established in Tibet, Buddhist order, was the Nyingma. So they're the oldest tradition. And next came the Kagyu. So you may have heard of His Holiness Karmapa. He's the head of the Karma Kagyu. Then there were the Sakya. And then the order that our organization belongs to is Golukpa, which was founded by Lama Tsongkhapa, whose statue is in the garden down here on the left-hand side as you go down. So anyway, his name was Chekwa, and he was from a famous Nyingma family and followed that tradition. And then one day he came across a text called the 8 Verses of Thought Transformation. He just happened to see, I think it was like almost saw it in the road, this verse from the 8 Verses of Thought Transformation. And again, it's this radical change from our usual way of thinking. So in the verse, it said, you ask for blessings to offer the victory to others and take the loss upon yourselves. And so Chekwa was intrigued by this. He thought that he'd never come across a teaching like that before and wanted to understand more about it and have a commentary on it, an explanation of it. So he went in search of the author of that text, who was called Geshe Langri Tangpa. So he'd already passed away, he'd already died. But his main disciple was Sharowa. So Chekwa found Sharowa, I think, in Lhasa, and begged him for the teachings. He first went to one of the public teachings that Sharowa was giving, and he was listening really carefully, but he didn't hear anything about, this radical concept of offering the victory to others and taking the loss on yourself or anything close to it. And so he bailed him up on the circumambulation when he was doing circumambulations and begged him for teachings. And so after checking out that he was sincere, Sharowa taught him about Lojong. So the most famous practitioners of Lojong were the direct and indirect disciples of Lama Atisha. So he had one main lay disciple called Dromtompa, and then his teachings, they became this group known as the Kadampas. So they're very down to earth, very simple, practical approach to the Dharma. And so these Lojong teachings, these thought transformation teachings, were just passed guru to disciple within the group of the Kadampas, but not widely taught. And so when Chekwa received these teachings, he studied for a long time, again, years with Geshe Sharowa. He was really impressed by the teachings and felt that they were so valuable that they should be shared with other people. And so he started by teaching them to the lepers in Tibet. And it became known for a while as lepers' Dharma. So again, he just taught it to small groups of lepers. And what happened was he had this kind of tough, difficult-minded brother who was intrigued by what these secret teachings were, so listened in. And Geshe, who was known later as Geshe Chekwa, saw the softening of his brother's heart, if you like, the opening of his mind and the softening of his heart. And he thought, well, if it can help even my brother, it should be made public, and plus the help it had given to the lepers. So it was Geshe Chekwa who made these teachings public, and they were no longer secret after that. And he compiled a famous text called the 7-Point Thought Training. So these are the most famous, if you like, or the most popularly known Lojong thought transformation texts. So the 8 Verses of Thought Transformation and the 7-Point Thought Training by Geshe Chekwa. So there are many other texts, but they're the main ones. So from that point, Lojong thought transformation was taught as part of general teachings, as part of the teachings on the graduated path to enlightenment, often taught on the basis of the 8 verses or the 7-Point thought transformation. So then over the years, different other texts were also taught, but they're the two most famous ones. And then we come to the text that we're looking at today, which is from the Nyingma lineage, taught by Nyingma Lama, this oldest tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. And his name is Dodrupchen Rinpoche. Jigme Tempe Nima, but that won't mean anything to you, because when you first meet Tibetan names, they are someone speaking a foreign language. So anyway, I'll just give you a brief background of Dodrupchen Rinpoche. So he lived, he was born in 1865 and died in 1926. So the 19th, early 20th century. So he was born in Eastern Tibet, and his father was a very famous Lama called Dujam Lingpa. And he was the eldest of 7. He had 7 younger brothers, all of whom were recognized as famous reincarnate lamas. So he was recognized as the incarnation of the second Dodrupchen Rinpoche by Dzogchen Rinpoche, quite a famous Nyingma Lama, whose most recent incarnation actually lives in Australia now, down near Geelong, and teaches regularly in Australia, pandemic allowing. So as a child, Dodrupchen Rinpoche was recognized and went to study at Dzogchen Monastery. So I'll just read you a brief story of when he was a child in that monastery. At the beginning, it was difficult for him to understand the meaning of philosophical texts. He often cried himself to sleep, and in the morning he would find his head stuck to the pillow because of his tears. One morning he said to his tutor, "Last night in a dream, I saw 3 lamas in ascetic costume in a temple. The middle one was holding a volume in his hand. I asked him, 'Who are you? What is this volume?' He replied, 'I am Dokensei Yeshe Dorji, a famous Nyingma Lama. This volume is for helping people who cannot learn their lessons.' I asked him to give me the book. He did so, and I felt extremely happy. So I have confidence that if I study today, I shall learn." Thereafter, the breadth of his understanding suddenly burst forth, and he had no difficulty in understanding the meaning of the text. So he received teachings from many high lamas, and one of the famous lamas around at that time was called Patrul Rinpoche. So you may have heard of his famous text called Words of My Perfect Teacher, which is on this Lamrim, on the graduated path to enlightenment. He was famous for his bodhicitta. And so Patrul Rinpoche recognized the qualities of Dodrupchen Rinpoche. And when he was 8 years old, take note of that, 8 years old, he asked Dodrupchen Rinpoche to give a public teaching to hundreds of people on this famous text on bodhicitta and thought transformation called A Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life by a famous 8th century Indian pundit called Shantideva. So just think about that. If you've got children, 8 years old, remember yourself, 8 years old, giving a public teaching to hundreds of people on a text. And he did it and was praised for the way he did it, his confidence, his understanding. And in his lifetime, Dodrupchen Rinpoche taught 100 times on this text. He taught this entire text 100 times, which is one of the fundamental texts for generating bodhicitta. So it's said that he had very high spiritual realizations, but never spoke about them. And one day when he was giving teachings, I think he was in his 40s, they describe it as a storm coming, and then he suddenly felt sick, and he remained sick and unable to walk from that time. He lived for another 20 or so years. But as a result of that illness, he moved into a separate hermitage with a group of monks to support him, and he remained in seclusion for the rest of his life, to the point where he didn't usually allow, or very few others were allowed to even enter his hermitage. He sometimes taught to other lamas or received teachings from other lamas, and they were allowed to enter. But it was a very strict situation. And it's said that although he was very ill, or often ill, he never rested, and then almost never rested, and he was constantly engaged in writing, study, or meditation. So this text that we'll be going through, Turning Suffering and Happiness into Enlightenment, he wrote while he was living in that hermitage during this period of seclusion. And there's quite a nice description of Dodro Rinpoche I'd like to share with you. So it says, he was a hidden ascetic, so it was very difficult to know the depth of his inner realizations or views. Like a child, he was free from pride and easy to be with, yet his mind was profound and he spoke the truth. Because of the simplicity of his way of life, the richness of his qualities, the profundity of his scholarship, and the discipline that he had over his own mind, whenever intellectuals and powerful people came before him, they simply became humble, silent, and subdued in his presence. Dodiupchen. So it was also in the book I was reading his biography in, Masters of Meditation and Miracles, it was pointed out that the present, the 14th Dalai Lama, has praised the works of the third Dodrupchen Rinpoche in his private interviews and public speeches as the greatest scholarly works on the Nyingma view. So he was a scholar and also a realized yogi, a practitioner of the spiritual path. So how in our organization we came to be introduced to this text, which when I was doing research, it's not commonly taught. I only saw one other book with a very partial commentary on it. So somewhere in his reading of text, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who's the spiritual head of organization, must have come across it and decided that it was valuable. So in 1987, the year I took ordination, I had the privilege of I don't know what you'd call me, like dog's body on Lama Zopa Rinpoche's tour of Australia and New Zealand. I did, lots of jobs, cooking and secretary and cleaning and different things. And when we came to New Zealand, we stayed at one of our centers there. We were part of for those who don't know, a large worldwide organization with more than 160 centers and activities around the world in many countries. And one of our early centers was established in New Zealand in a beautiful area, Coromandel. It's called Mamuja Center. So we were there for quite a while. There were quite a few teachings happened there. And for one weekend course where a lot of people came from outside, then Rinpoche taught on this text called Turning Suffering and Happiness into Enlightenment. And it was a weekend course. And very unusually for Rinpoche, when it was over, he said that he would like it published as a book. He doesn't often talk about, promote his own teachings in that way. And so that was one of the early ones that I translated and that I learned to edit on. So some of you will know Venerable Rabina. So I was learning how to edit and she was helping to mentor me in that process. And so together we worked on the book that's had a few incarnations called Transforming Problems into Happiness, which are the teachings that Lama Zopa gave during that weekend. So in these teachings in this book, he only covers about half the text. But for me, he covers the important one, which was turning suffering or problems into happiness. Because most of us don't have the problem of having to deal with too much happiness. I mean, you may have a different personal situation, but my general individual situation and what I've observed is most of us need more help dealing with our problems than dealing with having too much happiness or everything going too right in our lives. Although there are dangers if you're practicing a spiritual path, if everything gets too comfortable. So the book itself only covers about, well, it's the major part of the text, but it's concentrating on turning suffering or problems into happiness, into the path to enlightenment. So do you have copies on your device, or most of you? I'll read out as I go through anyway. Yeah. So I'm not sure who translated this. There was no acknowledgement. Many years ago, I received a kind of like a 1970s style document with no name for the translator. And the only other translation I saw was done by a Nyung Lama, but I preferred this translation. So that's why we've got this particular one. So the title of the text is Turning Suffering and Happiness into Enlightenment. And it starts with an homage, which is traditional in Buddhist texts. And it's paying homage to Chenrezig, whose Sanskrit name is Avalokiteshvara. So Chenrezig is the Buddha behind me. This is the thousand-arm aspect of Chenrezig. And Chenrezig is the Buddha of compassion, the embodiment of all the Buddha's compassion. So the homage verse is, I pay homage to noble Avalokiteshvara, Chenrezig, recalling his qualities. Always happy at the happiness of others and deeply saddened when they suffer. One who has fully realized the qualities and understanding of great compassion and who rejects both his own happiness and suffering. So then the Dodrupsham Rinpoche has a little foreword explaining why he's composing the text. This is also quite a traditional way. I'm going to put down here a partial instruction on how to use both happiness and suffering as the path to enlightenment. This is indispensable for leading a spiritual life and quite the most priceless teaching in the world. So I'll pause there in terms of the text because traditionally, in terms of mind training teachings, there are standard preliminaries. And especially for those of you who haven't had much exposure to Buddhist teachings, then I probably should talk about them a little before we actually start the text. So there are 4 traditional preliminaries before you study thought training or thought transformation teachings. So these are appreciating our perfect human rebirth, remembering impermanence and death, recollecting karma, and being aware of the nature of samsara, or of the existence that we're caught in. So I'd like to just briefly discuss these 4 preliminaries, especially for those who haven't had much exposure to Buddhism. So the first one is appreciating our perfect human rebirth. So again, for those of you who aren't Buddhist, who are just exploring Buddhist notions, while these teachings make a lot more sense if you have faith in things like refuge, karma, and reincarnation, they can still be useful even if you don't have those kind of beliefs. So in terms of Buddhist beliefs, then there are said to be 6 different types of existence. And having a human existence is said to be optimum in terms of spiritual practice. So you don't need to get too embroiled in what the 6 are, but if you just think of the two realms of existence that you're aware of, the human and the animal, when you compare our situation to the situation of an animal, you can see that in terms of developing our mind, transforming our mind, following a spiritual path, we have many more advantages than an animal has, even if it's a very spoiled pet dog or cat. So they have very limited understanding and they have limited ability to communicate. So Lama Zopa often gives the example of if you have a parrot, it can learn to mimic mantras or even say Buddhist slogans, but it could never understand the meaning or change its mind on the basis of the meaning. So compared to animals, we have an incredibly fortunate rebirth. And then when you think about even in the human world, the different types of lives we're aware of in different countries, then you can see and appreciate the very special circumstances that we have, even in terms of the pandemic here in Australia at the moment. But just think about the fact that traditionally it's taught in terms of what's called freedoms and endowments. But basically, you don't have to understand those to understand that you have a very privileged position. The fact that you're able to come here this weekend to do what you want, basically, isn't it? You know, you have, you know, no matter what problems you may have in terms of relationships or work or illness or whatever, you've all been able to gather here without too much difficulty this morning on a beautiful winter day. You know, you're not having to slave in some unfortunate situation to earn the basic means of living. You're at least healthy enough to make the way up the hill to the Gompa. You know, even if you're not completely healthy, you have the intellect or the intelligence to understand what I'm saying. And when you want to communicate with me, you have the ability to communicate your questions or ideas. And so, yeah, we have incredible freedoms and incredible richnesses in terms of the lives that we have to be able to make our lives meaningful. And so the point of this first meditation, this appreciation of this first meditation, is just not to take that for granted, you know, that we have a very privileged position, that if you have some interest in spirituality, you can pursue it, you know. You're not sort of working hard all day long, collapsing with exhaustion, getting up the next day to work all day long. You have some leisure time. You have some freedom to read books, to watch things on YouTube, to come up here and do a course. You know, so just appreciate that you do have a lot to be grateful for, not take it for granted. So the next preliminary for these teachings is to remember impermanence and death. So let's have a little. So this follows on from the previous one, you know, so it's like, yes, we do have this very special position of having a relatively healthy body and mind and this freedom to do what we want to do, to pursue our interests. But the other thing we shouldn't take for granted is that we have it for a long time, you know, because this is, I mean, we're all intelligent enough to know that we're going to die one day, right? It's inevitable. Once you're born, as Bob Dylan used to say, those not busy being born are busy dying. So we're on the way to only one goal, despite what these billionaires are trying to do in terms of prolonging life and replacing, you know, Elon Musk and co, whose next frontier after space, I think, is trying to make humans live forever, or at least themselves live forever. So it's inevitable that one day we're going to die. But what happens is, I mean, none of us are going to argue against that. You'd have to be a bit crazy to say, no, I'm not going to die. I'm going to be the person who's immortal. But we don't have the lived experience of the imminence of death, you know, because none of us can guarantee how long we can live, right? None of us can guarantee actually that we can make it back here after lunch, that we won't die, you know. So the point of this is not to make ourselves anxious and depressed and worried that you're going to fall down and sort of die on the Chenrezig hill, but just to give us some kind of impetus for practice. Because what we tend to do, and I'm really guilty of this, is procrastinate. Right? I mean, because we always think we've got the time. Now, I'm starting not to feel myself too much about that because I'm getting older, you know? So it's like, I try to do these calculations in my mind now of things I would like to achieve in terms of the spiritual path. And I'm now saying, well, who knows, you know, because inevitably it's like even a long-lived Australian is going to, you know, maybe die 70s, 80s, and we don't know about the incapacity. And there's a thing that struck me when I first met it in Lamrim teachings, when they talk about this part. They say that when we do procrastinate, we take things for granted. And so, you know, we first spend the first 20 years kind of going to school and getting trained. We spend the next 20 years kind of earning a living, establishing ourselves in life. And then the next 20 years, we're kind of not well enough or exhausted and don't give priority to practice. right? And many, I mean, you know how it is with any plan. There's all these things that we're going to do later, you know, especially the ones that are a bit difficult and require effort. We'll get around to it, you know. And so it's all very well to plan like that, especially if you've got a family or you've got a job or whatever, that you'll get to your spiritual practice when you retire, maybe. But the other thing to take into account is when you're making these plans when you're young and healthy, there's no guarantee either that you'll be healthy even or have the energy for what you would like to do when you're older. And so the difficulty is that we need to give some priority to our spiritual life. Now, it kind of, with the books I've been reading in preparation for this course over the last few weeks, it just made me smile sometimes because, I mean, I became a nun to concentrate on a spiritual life. You know, I thought that's the way to kind of, you know, you don't have the family, you don't have the job as such, you know, the outside work, you concentrate. And yet it's still, in some ways, it's so easy for it not to happen, you know. So the challenge is not to procrastinate, not to put things off, but to incorporate spiritual activity into your everyday life. Because let's face it, whatever situation you're in, whether you've got a family or a job or, you know, you have to support yourself, you have to live in some way. And so when I was reading these books, it was like almost like fairy tales. You know, these were written centuries ago, usually by Tibetan monks, Tibetan lamas in Tibet. And so almost always the advice at some point in the text comes to, you should go into retreat in a solitary place, right? And I thought, well, you know, say in this room, Yeshi and I are probably the people most likely to have the opportunity to go and do retreat in a solitary place. And she's already laughing, right? Because even as monks and nuns, you have these things that you do. I mean, I have editing work and, you know, we have these things we do. So while that's the ideal in many ways, because I mean, of course, the best way to work on your mind is to not have too many distractions, to be in a place where you can concentrate on your mind, because that's the most important thing to do, is to transform your mind. But let's face it, even as monks and nuns, we find that difficult to do. So as lay people with families, with jobs, with, you know, houses to pay off and different situations, then unless you have incredible determination, it's difficult to do. So I think the point is not to think you're going to do this when you retire, but to incorporate it now in some way into your life so that you start to live a kind of a more spiritual life now while you're in the midst of all the things you have to do in daily life. And the impetus for doing this is to remember impermanence and death. Not to think that death is something that happens to old people and not to you, because any of us can die at any time. And when I think about the complexity of the body sometimes, my knowledge of it now is a bit rusty. It's amazing that we hang together in day-to-day life, you know, all the complicated processes that go on automatically in our body are amazing. So it's more a surprise that we don't have more problems than we do in terms of illness and how our body functions. So while we do have a relatively healthy body, while we do have a healthy mind, then it's good to just remember each day that there's no guarantee about the future in any way, no matter what our age is and no matter what our health status is, because it's not that only sick people die. Healthy people die every day, you know. And this week we had a reminder of impermanence death because Glenn, who used to be our maintenance man here, we went and did a ceremony at his place on Tuesday afternoon, and a few hours later he passed away. So it's like there are constant reminders, and family and friends, there are constant reminders that, you know, we're not immortal, we're not invincible. This body is a fragile thing. There are so many causes. Well, as the teachings say, there are so many causes for death and so few supports for life, really. So just don't take it for granted that you're always going to be able to do what you want to do and that you're going to live for a long time. It's simply not guaranteed. Yes.
be cleaning out, you know, the place where the cats were or whatever she did, and she kept saying, "This is the last time that I'm going to be doing blah blah blah." And I find it really powerful when I say those words.
Yeah.
It just catapults me right into the present moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And so Lama Tsongkhapa had this recommendation that when you woke up in the morning, you actually said to yourself, "This is the day I'm going to die," right? And it's a way of prioritizing what you're doing. Because, okay, if you actually believe this is the last day that you're going to die, how would you spend it? What would you concentrate on? What would you mend in your life? What would you heal in your life? And I think you would guarantee that you wouldn't be perpetuating minor grievances and little squabbles with people, that you would be concentrating on your inner feelings, on your mind, on transforming your mind, on living a positive way and interacting with people in a positive way. And so then the follow-on from that is when you get to the end of the day and you haven't died, you can rejoice, because with that thought that you weren't going to die, you were going to die, you did some positive things, thought some positive things, did some positive actions. And it's no loss, you know, it's actually helped your life. And okay, good, you've lived today, and tomorrow you may have another opportunity to create more positive, have more positive thoughts and do more positive actions. So it's a way just to give a sense of urgency to our practice, to our spiritual pursuits. Just don't feel complacent. Don't feel that you're going to live for years and you'll get around to doing the things you want to do, and to really think about the things you want to do that give your life meaning, you know, especially in this age of distraction. So then the next thing that's traditionally discussed as a preliminary is karma. So again, you know, if you don't have faith in Buddhism, if you don't follow Buddhist beliefs, some of this may seem a little strange to you, but I'd like to outline it for you so you understand when we're talking about things in the text, how we're seeing things. So karma is a Sanskrit word, and it translates actually as action. So basically, karma has to do with our actions of body, of speech, and of mind. So our physical actions, our speech, and what we're thinking. So of course, the thinking is the hardest one to control. We have a little control, hopefully, over our physical and verbal actions, but difficult with the mind. So Lama Yeshe had this quote. So he said that karma is very simple. It's just watching your body, speech, and mind. But yeah, it's not simple to keep those body, speech, and mind always positive. So in terms of karma, there are 4 basic laws that you need to understand, and this will help you to understand when the text's talking about repercussions and motivations for doing things, why we might think in a certain way. So the first law of karma, another translation of karma, which I find, there are various translations, but I find quite useful, is actions and their consequences. So sometimes it's translated as action and result, but to me that just brings me back to that scientific thing, and it makes it seem like it's an equal thing. And it's not, as you'll learn in the laws of karma. It's not seen as a you know, something, you do something in this life and something happens to you in next life. It's not like that. There's an increase of karma, which I'll explain in terms of the laws. So actions and its consequences gives, I think, a broader view of karma. So the first law of karma is that karma is definite. Oh, the other thing to understand about karma is that it's a really subtle subject. So to understand the complete ramifications of karma, you need the mind of a Buddha, fully enlightened mind, an omniscient mind. So in terms of Buddhism, and this sometimes startles people because there's this sort of sometimes popular belief is that, you know, Buddhism is scientific and rational. And then you come across these things that says, no, actually, you know, you can't understand karma with your rational mind. You have to have the mind of a Buddha. So just be aware. But in terms of understanding, it's actually easier to understand emptiness, the way that things exist, rationally and scientifically, and you can't apply that understanding to karma. So there are certain things you have to take on faith. So the first law of karma is that karma is definite. And this is something that you have to take on faith. So what this means, basically, if you do positive actions and have positive thoughts, there's a positive result of happiness. Not necessarily in this life, because we have belief in future lives. It could be in future lives. And not necessarily the next future life, it could be many future lives in the future. And of course, corollary of that is that if you negative thoughts and negative actions result in suffering, whether in this life or in future lives. So from positive comes positive, and from negative come negative results. So that's the basic law of karma. The karma is definite. The second law of karma is the scary one, which is that karma increases or is expandable. So this is what I was saying about karma isn't fair. It's like, it would seem fair to me that if I stole something from someone in this life, then it would be reasonable in next life or a future life that somebody else stole from me. But it expands. What's said is that if I steal something in this life, it could be that for 500 lifetimes I have things stolen from me. So it's not a simple equation. That's why I don't like action and result, you know. So from a very small positive thing, a large result of happiness can happen. And from a very small negative thing, a large suffering result can happen. It's not, it's said that the only good thing about negative karma is that it can be purified. So it's not set in concrete or some inevitable thing. So what can happen is that we can destroy positive karma with very negative states of mind and different things. But the other important thing to understand is that we can purify negative karma with positive states of mind and certain practices, certain Buddhist practices. And there are things called the 4 antidotes that you can apply to karma to purify it, which we may have time to talk about later. But the important one to remember, or the strongest one in terms of a remedy for any negative thought and action, is regret. So the stronger regret you feel for something negative that you've done, the more purification happens. So always remember that it's important to regret things when you recognize that you've done something negative. And there are other things you can do to purify the negative karma. So as you can see, it's like, you know, they have the image in the teachings of a drop of water is very small, but if it keeps falling, it fills up a giant jar. So it's very important to be careful about always trying to create even the smallest positive thing and to not do even the smallest negative thing. So the next one is quite important to understand. The next law of karma is that you don't experience the results for actions that you haven't, for things you haven't done or haven't created. So you don't experience karma you can't experience karma on behalf of someone else, for example. And if something happens to you, you created the cause for it. So this is quite important in terms of understanding the thinking with this mind training text, is there's nothing and nobody else to blame, right? So all your experiences come from your own mind. And that's quite a fundamental thing to take on board and can radically change your attitude when things go wrong. It's fine when things go right. We like to be the author of that we created the cause for everything to go right. But it's not so comfortable for us when things go wrong to accept the responsibility for what's gone wrong. So whatever happens to you, in Buddhist terms, you've created the cause for it. It's not because somebody did something or somebody else. It's you, and you don't experience other people's karma and they don't experience yours. And then the final law of karma is that karma is never lost, or sometimes it's said wasted, never lost. So what this means is that how it's seen is that we have karmic propensities stored on our mind stream. So there's this mind stream, if you like, it's a sort of general way of seeing it, going from life to life. And so as we do positive actions, have positive thoughts, then positive, what are called imprints, are laid on that mind stream, that mental continuum. As we do negative actions and have negative thoughts, then negative imprints are laid on that mental stream. And they're never lost. It's never that it's, you know, because we're talking beginningless mind, endless lifetimes. It's not that it's, you know, after 100 years or some point in eons in the future, hundreds of years in the future, that karma, it doesn't have a use by date. It's not that it expires at some point. It stays there until the conditions come that mean, in the case of a positive imprint, that it ripens as some form of happiness, and a negative imprint, it ripens as some kind of suffering. So it's there, that potential for happiness and suffering is there in our mind, and that's also quite important to be aware of. And again, that's unless there is some interruption for the negative karma in terms of purification, or the most effective way to finish negative karma, if you like, is the realization of emptiness, of the way the things really, the way things actually exist. So then we'll talk about the fourth preliminary, which is in some ways an uncomfortable one, is the nature of our existence. So again, this gives you a context when we come to the thought training teachings. These 4 preliminary points give you a context that help you to understand the kind of thinking that we have in relation to problems and happiness. So the thing to understand is that the nature of our existence is suffering. So when Buddha gave his first teaching, he became enlightened in Bodh, this small town in India. And then for about 6 or 7 weeks, he didn't teach because he felt that the insights he'd had, the realizations he had, were too kind of subtle or too complicated to share with others. And it was only when he was begged to teach that he walked to Varanasi and gave his first teaching, what's called the first turning of the wheel in the deer park in Sarnath in near Varanasi. And the first thing he taught was the truth of suffering. And so some people, when they hear about this, they think that, you know, Buddhists are kind of pessimists or depressing or whatever. But I think more it's Buddha was a realist. So he taught the true suffering, true cause of suffering, but he also taught true cessation of suffering and true path to that cessation. So it's not all on the negative side. But the thing that we have to understand, and the thing I certainly don't have the realization of yet, is that until we've developed our mind, until we have realizations, then our existence is suffering. So I was just thinking about it this morning when I woke up, and it was a beautiful clear sky and the maple tree was in bloom and everything looked beautiful. It's like there's a verse in one of the practices we do daily that says we shouldn't see this world as a beautiful park. We should actually see it as an ocean of suffering, if you like. But it's really hard. But when you really investigate the teachings and investigate the way we do exist, the way we do operate, then yes, our existence is suffering. We have respite from it, and some of us have more fortunate lives, if you like, more positive karma than others. But the basic underlying thing is suffering. And that's hard to accept, I think, sometimes. I remember one time Lama Zopa Rinpoche was saying, because he was talking about people who don't follow a spiritual path, the materialists, people who believe there's just this life. And he said, it shocked me at the time, but that's because I do tend to see this place quite often as a beautiful park. He said to me, if you really believe that, if you really believe there was just this life, why wouldn't you kill yourself? Right? Because his way was, since it is suffering, once you've understood it is suffering, and if you think there's nothing else to rely on, there's just this life, why wouldn't you shorten it? Why wouldn't you shorten your suffering? But of course, it's not as simple as that for us. So the thing to understand is that when we talk about this term samsara, sometimes we kind of get confused and talk about it in terms of external, like the world is samsara, or, you know, the environment or something. It's not. We're actually talking about our basic mode of existing. So in Buddhist terms, what's seen is that we're caught in a cycle of suffering, that because of the cause of suffering, and the cause of suffering are negative karma and delusions, or disturbing thoughts, mental afflictions. There are many translations of that term. Because the nature of our mind has this negative karma and delusions, then we're caught in this cycle of rebirth into suffering. And until we follow the spiritual path, and particularly develop the realization, the direct perception of emptiness, we're caught in this cycle of suffering. And sometimes we're up, sometimes we're down, sometimes there's more happiness or what looks like happiness than suffering. But the actual underlying nature of our existence is one of suffering, because we've taken this body and mind under the influence of negative karma and delusions. And so therefore, until we can break that cycle, then there is no experience of ultimate happiness. And so often there's a simple way to present the suffering of the cycle we're caught in is to talk about what's called the 3 types of suffering. So in Buddhist terms, there's the suffering of pain, or the suffering of suffering, which is what we recognize as suffering or problems, the things in our, you know, physically and mentally that we experience as suffering, things like illness and pain and, you know, grief, anxiety, depression, all these kinds of things are obvious sufferings. The next suffering is called the suffering of change. So this is bad news for us. So what this says is that, and it's more subtle than that first suffering, and you have to think about it and meditate on it to really get the point. So what this says is that all the things that we regard as sources of happiness and experiences of pleasure in our life are actually disguised suffering. They're actually the suffering of suffering. So what this means is this suffering of change. So it's probably best just to use an example. So, okay, say you love chocolate, and someone gives you a box of chocolates, your favorite chocolates. And so you feel happy, right? And as you eat the first one, there's kind of bliss, there's a blissful feeling, there's a happy feeling. And so then, okay, maybe even the second one, you're still feeling quite happy. But as you eat more and more, your happiness doesn't increase. If that chocolate was the actual source of happiness, then it should be endless bliss as you ate more and more. But we all know that's not the case. What it leads to is aversion to chocolate and vomiting if you really push the fact, not to mention long-term health disadvantages. So like if chocolate was the source of happiness and a real source of happiness, then the more chocolate you had, the happier you should become. It's obvious it isn't like that. And if you think of anything that you love, anything that brings you pleasure, it's the same. There's nothing, no matter what you're attached to, that brings you happiness. you know, sex, music, money, whatever, the more you pursue it, the less happiness there is. And eventually, what's seen in Buddhism is like its underlying nature becomes revealed. So what's revealed is that it's actually the suffering of suffering. It's not real happiness. And so the real happiness comes from spiritual realizations, from following the spiritual path, developing your mind, actually developing realizations. And then the third type of suffering is called pervasive compounding suffering. So this is this suffering I've been talking about in terms of the nature of samsara. So this is the fact that we've been born with this kind of body and mind because we've been born under the control of negative karma and delusions. So of course there's a suffering result. No matter how much we fool ourselves about the nature of our existence, the underlying all of it is this pervasive compounding suffering. So it's pervasive and it compounds future life suffering, because with this type of body and mind, unless we're working really hard on the spiritual path and developing realizations, we continue to do negative actions and have negative thoughts, creating the cause for future suffering rebirths. So that's the three types of suffering, and a simple way to understand how Buddhists see our current existence. So these are the preliminaries that are good to have in mind, even if you are unfamiliar with them or don't necessarily understand them or have faith in them, that underline the kind of thinking that comes in this thought transformation text. But again, a lot of them are things you can apply whether or not you believe these basic Buddhist concepts. So at this point, I'd just like to ask if there are any questions on anything I've covered so far. Feel free to ask anything. You don't have to feel shy. Yes.
You may have answered it already in your first one, but one of my questions is how to not feel complacent about, you know, the privileged position that you have, or the fact that you do have happiness, not too much suffering in your life. But I think point one might be just be grateful.
Well, yeah, no, it is to feel grateful, but again, to just think of impermanence and death, that while you have this privileged situation now, there's no guarantee it's going to last, you know, and to make it meaningful while you have it. And the important thing is not just meaningful for yourself, but meaningful as much as possible for others. So that's what we have to think about really carefully, is how to have a meaningful life, which we'll be discussing in more detail. Yeah. So yeah, of course, rejoice in the fact that you've created the causes for this comfortable position. But what it's said is that with positive karma, that if you don't continue using it in a meaningful way to create more positive karma, then it's like you're exhausting your resources. You're using up, if you like, you're using up your positive karma if you're not creating further causes for happiness. And so just know that at some point, and we even know that within our own lives, when we have periods when suddenly everything was wonderful and then suddenly everything went wrong. So what we see in Buddhist terms is that we've exhausted our merit, our positive energy, and that we need to create more to change that situation, not necessarily for ourselves, but that we all know that if we're overwhelmed by suffering and problems, it's very difficult for us to be of use to others, to benefit others, because we're so caught up in our own suffering and our own problems. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, so just for this last period before we have morning tea, I won't return to the text just yet. But I'd like to talk about something that helps us to understand also the framework. Is this, we're talking about transforming our mind. And so we have to have some knowledge of what we're trying to transform, what we're trying to alter. You know, we're in pursuit of happiness, ideally ultimate happiness, liberation from samsara and enlightenment. But even temporary happiness feels better than temporary suffering, immediate suffering. So the things we have to do is to understand the nature of our minds. And so again, this a fundamental practice in Buddhism is watching your mind, checking your mind. And what we have to check for, particularly, are what are known as delusions. So as I said, there are many translations for this, of mental afflictions, different things. But one that Lama Zopa Rinpoche uses that I find quite helpful is he calls them disturbing thoughts. Because that's what they do, these delusions, they disturb your mind. Some in a more subtle way than others. So when it comes to understanding the main delusions, so the basis, if you like, is ignorance, from which the other delusions come. So this ignorance isn't simply not knowing stuff, you know. We're all ignorant in that way because there's so much stuff to know. This ignorance is kind of a wrong understanding of the way we ourselves exist and how things exist. So we'll touch on this more later in terms of the importance of applying emptiness. But it means that we have a basic misconception about the way we exist. That's the fundamental one, and it's called self-grasping. So what we do is we grasp onto ourselves, a self, as having some kind of true existence or inherent existence or existence from its own side. And it seems to us that's the way we exist, which is a misconception. So this takes, you have to hear about this a lot, read about it, meditate on it, to come to understand and grasp, because it's quite subtle. Because it's important not to fall into the trap of thinking that nothing exists, nothing matters. You know, go to the other extreme from thinking that everything exists and exists truly. So what we have to think about here in terms of the way we exist is that we exist as what's called a dependent arising. So the way to understand, so many of you haven't met me. So a simple way to understand how we reify things or give them to existence is that you probably saw the name of the person who was teaching this course, but, oh, you probably saw a photo too, actually. But say you're a stranger coming to Chenrezig Institute and someone introduces me and says, you know, this is Ailsa, probably says Venerable Ailsa, not a term that I'm terribly fond of. And so what happens when you're introduced to someone is that you kind of make it concrete, right? So before a stranger saw me walking around, they might have projected things like, oh, there's a nun, there's a Buddhist nun, certain age, blah, blah, blah. But until they put that label of Ailsa on it, someone introduces you and says, oh, that nun's called Ailsa. And so then in that person's mind, it's like Ailsa. So every time they see me after that, and every time you see me after this, oh, that's Ailsa. But what happens is you forget that whole process of labeling. Somehow I seem to have some true existence, some essence that's Ailsa, right? And you forget that at one stage I was just a little nun walking around Chenrezig whose name you didn't know. But once you know the name and you believe that that is my name, then I become this kind of fixed concept in your mind. And the thing to understand is we do that with everything, but most importantly with ourselves. We hold on to this kind of, we feel we have this essence, and that's called self-grasping. And that seems to exist from its own side. That doesn't depend on labeling, it doesn't depend on the base, it doesn't depend on a thought. It just seems to have some kind of concrete self-existence. And that's the fundamental ignorance that we have to battle, because things do not, you do not exist, I do not exist in that way, things do not exist in that way. Anyway, so on the basis of this basic ignorance, this grasping so tightly to ourselves and our view of ourselves actually, then on the basis of that, the other two main disturbing thoughts or delusions that arise are attachment and aversion, or hatred or anger, different names for them. So attachment, so think of all those things that are my, you know, my possessions, my family, my son, my daughter, my career, my this, my that, the things that we're attached to. So the things we're attached to tend to be the things that we see as helping or supporting this misconceived I that we have. And then the anger or the aversion or the hatred arises from those that seem to be harming this concrete I. The things we reject, the things we don't want anything to do with, the things we feel angry about, are the ones that seem to harm that I, or those things that we're calling my. So the basic excuse me, definition of attachment is that it is disturbing thought that exaggerates the positive qualities of something and wants to possess it or own it in some way. So it's a subtle delusion in some ways. So anger is a disturbing thought that exaggerates the negative qualities of something and wants to harm it in some way or reject it in some way. So we all know that in terms of disturbing thoughts, anger seems the more disturbing one, right? Because as it said, nobody lives happily with anger. It's a very unsettling mind. It's a very unhappy mind. And not only does it make you unhappy, it makes the people around you happy. And I think we all know that if you can think of angry people you know in your lives, they're not people you feel relaxed with. They're not people you want to spend time with. They're people that you often, if they're really angry, tend to cross the street to not interact with. And it unsettles the person who has the anger, and it unsettles those people around it. So it's easy to see that as a mind, I think, that you want to get rid of. I don't think many people would like to have more anger or to, you know, be more angry in their interactions with people. So in some ways, it's easy to see that that's a disturbing thought you want to get rid of. Attachment's more sneaky because attachment seems to be like your friend, like, you know, someone who's looking out for you and wanting you to have more happiness. So the image that used is attachments like oiling cloth. It's kind of, yeah, it's difficult to get rid of. It's difficult to recognize really as attachment, and it's difficult to want to get rid of it because we see it as bringing us pleasure. That's the source of my happiness or my pleasure. But if you understand about the suffering of change, then you know it's not a source of real happiness. And it's like, and the addictive quality of it. So the image that's often used is like moths flying into a candle flame, you know, that there's that attachment that you can endanger yourself. And you think of addicts, addictions to various things, you can see that mind of attachment and how it works. And Lama Tsongkhapa says that the biggest suffering of samsara is following desire, following attachment, and never finding satisfaction. So just think about that and think about the examples in your own life where whether you're talking about whatever, you know, whether you're talking about food, work, sex, all the things we can get attached to, get addicted to. And the more you pursue it, the more you push it, the more suffering you experience. And it's never satisfying. It's never satisfying because it's actually the suffering of change. So the underlying thing is suffering of pain or suffering of suffering. There's no way you're going to find happiness or satisfaction by following your attachment. But still, it's what we're accustomed to. It's a custom, and we have a whole society that supports and propagates and tries to encourage us to have attachment to things. And you'll see in advertisements, right, the kind of ideal images that are promoted. And it's always you're going to be happy, like this is going to change your life if you have this computer or this new phone or this new car. But we all know that there's no satisfaction in having those things, because next year there'll be a new Apple phone out, you know, we'll be up to Apple 13, I guess. And even if you get that one, it won't be satisfying because following attachment or desire never leads to satisfaction. It leads to more dissatisfaction. So often in terms of disturbing thoughts or delusions, the other two that are mentioned are arrogance or pride and jealousy. So arrogance, yeah, that's simple. I think we all understand puffed up people, self-important people. So the thing to understand about arrogance and pride is that it's a block or a barrier to learning. And so it prevents you, that lack of humility, that lack of being, able to admit that you don't know everything or you're not the best at everything, is that people get discouraged in terms of talking to you or trying to teach you, or because you don't want to learn because of your pride. And it can be pride in ridiculous things like the way you look or the knowledge you have. And then jealousy again. Pride is a bit like attachment. It can feel like self-confidence or a positive thing that's helping you. But I think jealousy is another one of these minds like anger or aversion that just feels uncomfortable, right? So jealousy is resenting the good qualities or the good things that happen to other people. And so in terms of the Buddhist practice of watching your mind, and in terms of applying thought transformation, so what's recommended is that you watch your mind really closely and be ruthlessly honest with what's coming up in your mind. And the first thing to do that's good to do is to identify what your major delusion is, or your major disturbing thought. And this can change at different periods in your life. It can be different. So you identify the strongest delusion, if you like, and then you work on decreasing it. You work on applying antidotes to it. And so, for example, in terms of attachment, there are various things that are recommended that you meditate on when you feel strong attachment. And so in terms of being attached to somebody's body, the traditional one that's recommended that I've never found particularly helpful is that you meditate on the ugliness of the human body. So, I mean, we come from a society that kind of sort of has this deluded view of the human body as beautiful. And I remember one time Lama Zopa Rinpoche, because I was a doctor, he said to me, we're having a private talk, and he said to me that he didn't understand how doctors who've seen inside the human body and have to sort of, go into all the orifices of the human body could still feel sign of sexual attraction to somebody else's body. I just said it's no problem at all. But it's like this one I find difficult. I just, and when it was recommended in the text, it was often someone teaching to, for example, a large audience of monks. And so even in Shantideva, you'll come across these quite, for a female, confronting verses about the horribleness, the ugliness of a woman's body. But of course, in terms of a woman, you're supposed to be, or depending what your sexual attraction is too, you're supposed to be seeing anybody as unattractive, as ugly. So for me, I've found it always, in terms of dealing with attachment, more helpful to think about things like impermanent, how things are changing, and particularly to think about Lama Tsongkhapa's quote about even you follow that desire, you're not going to get satisfaction. Just keep reminding yourself that it's not going to make you happy, even though you think it is. It's not going to make you happy. And then you have to look at the shortcomings of following attachment. And we all know, in terms of sexual attraction and different things, the shortcomings of following through on those things. In terms of anger, then the antidotes to anger, one is patience. And Shantideva has a whole chapter on patience here, of how to deal. We may have time later to talk about some of those things. The other thing in terms of dealing, counteracting hatred or aversion, is to meditate on loving kindness and compassion. So loving kindness is the wish for all beings to have happiness and its causes. And compassion is the wish for all beings to be free from suffering and its causes. So there are standard Buddhist meditations on these topics. And so whenever you're feeling angry or feeling aversion to a particular person or a situation, then you bring to mind either patience or loving kindness and compassion. In terms of ignorance, then reading and understanding about emptiness helps with that fundamental ignorance of self-grasping. In terms of pride, then it's recommended that you think about all the things that you don't know and all the things you aren't good at, which are plenty of things. You want to think about quantum physics and different subjects, or in terms of Dharma, all the things you don't know about the Buddhist path. In terms of jealousy, then the recommended thing, which is quite hard to do if you have jealousy, is to rejoice in other people's good qualities. So rather than, feeling jealous and resenting someone else have something good happen to them, then you actually feel happiness from your heart that they've experienced something good like that. Because in Buddhist terms, we'd be saying, well, we know that that kind of good result comes from positive karma. So rejoice that that person created the causes, the good causes, to experience that happiness in their life. So at this point, I think we'll have a tea break because I'm certainly dry. I don't know, you may be behind masks as well.
Yes, can everyone check the COVID update during the break? We're on the strictest lockdown that Queensland's ever had.
Right.